Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment, but in the past everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right. And this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines, authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful. A very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering, we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So, we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'll give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RRAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we'd want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about, people getting, allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power. But here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL. And when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is, and with that is really where cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. This big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing it the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. A mobile device management that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about Azure's. With Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out, but it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. As we move into understanding Autopilot, how to configure it, how to use it and all that, I think it's very important that we can kind of visualize how this works. All right, so in this drawing, I want to help you visualize it. I want you to help you kind of grasp the concepts before we actually look at it. So the idea of Autopilot is to get away from that traditional idea of dealing with images in regards to our Microsoft devices. So in the traditional sense, if you went out and you bought a bunch of new computers from an OEM like Dell or HP or somebody like that, let's just use this little symbol here, and I'll just kind of shrink it down to make some room. Well, let's say you have these new computers, all right, we'll say new PCs, okay, and you've bought these new machines. They've already got Windows installed, okay? They've already got an up-to-date version of Windows installed, all right? The problem is there is software on these machines we don't like, right? A lot of times you buy a new computer, it has a bunch of what they call grayware or adware, advertising crap that we don't want. We want to get rid of this this crappy software that we don't. The other thing we don't like about these new PCs is they're not configured the way we want. There are settings turned on that we don't want or settings turned off that we do want, right? So we need a solution that's going to allow us to re-provision this machine, reconfigure, re-provision this machine. Now, in the past, the way we did that is we set up a reference image, we captured that image, and then we blew away these machines and we deployed that, and you know, that worked, and it was definitely faster than sitting down at each one of these machines one at a time and reinstalling, but it still isn't as fast as just reconfiguring what's there. I always use the analogy of, it's sort of like, let's say you go and you buy a new house sitting on some land, and you love the way the house is built, you love everything about the outside of the house, you love the way it looks inside, except you don't like any of the furnishings of the house. You don't like the furniture, you don't like the bathroom, you don't like the kitchen, you don't like any of that stuff. So instead of just, you know, pulling out all the furniture and the stuff you don't like that's on the inside of the house and replacing it, you know what you do? You hire a wrecking crew and you just knock the entire house over, and then you build a whole new house that looks exactly like the old house, and then you furnish it. Well, that's essentially what we're doing when we re-image a machine, okay? I know that's kind of funny and kind of extreme, but that's basically we're blowing away what's there and replacing it with the same operating system most of the time, and it's just got different furnishings on it. So the idea of reprovisioning is not doing that, right? It's taking what's already there and reconfiguring it the way we want. There's two ways to do that in the world we're living in, and that is using provisioning packages, which I'm not getting into in this video, or using Autopilot, which is what I'm explaining in this video. So the idea of Autopilot is, it's in the Microsoft world, this of course is going to be managed by Intune. So Intune is what's going to provide us this Autopilot capability, okay? So it is a feature that Intune is going to support for us. All right, so we have to make sure we have Intune, all of that, and the Autopilot service is associated with Intune. All right, and then what we're going to do is make it where these machines, when these machines get plugged in and turned on, they will, as long as there's an internet connection, they will just magically go to the internet and talk to Intune, and they know that they're associated to our Intune. And then what happens is you have what is known as a out-of-box experience configuration profile that these machines get tied to, and what happens there is the Autopilot will automatically manage the settings, the out-of-box experience, the OOBE settings on the machine, and then Intune, these devices get enrolled into Intune, and then Intune can deploy software. It can get rid of the software we don't want. It can put software on there that we do want. It can reconfigure these machines any way we want, deploy policies. You could even make these machines join the domain if you want. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff here you can do. Deploy updates. So it's incredibly powerful. Okay, but there's one missing ingredient here, something that you probably might think of here, and that is, how do these machines know that they belong to me? So if you buy a bunch of new computers from Dell or HP or some other OEM, how do these machines know? Okay, well, one way you could do it is you could just link these machines, assign licenses to the users that are going to sit at these machines, okay, and by setting up a license and linking Autopilot to your users, when the users go to log on using the out-of-box experience, then Autopilot would take over, because it would know, okay, well, these users are logging on and they have a license, and each user is tied to Autopilot through a out-of-box experience profile. But that's not the preferred way to do it. What we want to make happen is that these machines just boot up and just magically it happens. No user is even sitting there. As long as we have an internet connection, we want it to magically tie to this. So how's that going to happen? Well, the way that's going to happen is you have to know something called a device ID. Also, a device ID, there we go. Also known as a hardware ID, okay? Hardware ID. Device ID, hardware ID, there's various names for it, but it's the same thing. All right, now what is that? It's basically a serial number that is associated to your motherboard of your computer. Now you might say, well, what if I've got a virtual machine? Well, if you didn't know this, every virtual machine gets a global unique identifier serial number. So even virtual machines have unique identifiers, okay? And so what happens is you need to know what those identifiers are. All right, and if you know what those identifiers are, you can actually save the identifiers into what is known as a CSV file, a comma separated value file, and you can import that into Autopilot. And that's how it's going to know. So when these machines boot up, they automatically go to the internet and announce to the Intune Autopilot service, hey, I've got these device IDs. Intune matches it to our Intune service because we've already registered it. Okay. Now there's something else you can do that's really neat, and that is if you're working with an OEM, okay, like Dell or HP, one of those companies, if you're going to order these computers off the internet from them, you can let them know that you are going to use Autopilot, and you can let them know what your domain name is for your tenant, and they can be given the right to actually just register the information into your Autopilot for you. Or you can just request them to send you the CSV file, the spreadsheet that has all of the device IDs in it. Now, you might say, okay, well, what if it's too late? What if I didn't get my OEM to do it? What if I've got all of these machines already set up and I want to basically gather the device IDs? Well, there's actually a PowerShell command that you can use to do this, and I'm not going to explain it in this video. I just want to give you the overview of it. There is a PowerShell command that I can run. I can run it remotely. If I have network connectivity with these machines, I could run this command from one of these other machines and have it collect all of the device IDs from these new machines. So that's how we can do that, and then we can upload that into Intune. All right. And so that's the idea. So again, once you've collected these device IDs, it's registered in Intune Autopilot. You've created what is called an Autopilot out-of-box experience configuration profile. Basically, these machines can boot up. They'll connect into Intune Autopilot. They will download that config profile. It'll configure those machines the way you want it to be configured. Whatever software needs to be taken off, it'll Autopilot and Intune will instruct it to take it off. Whatever software needs to be put on, it'll install it because you can deploy software through Intune. And then any other configurations you want. If you want to put restrictions on this machine, like for example, maybe you want to disable the ability to use flash drives on these machines, you can do that with the help of Intune. And Autopilot is going to link all of that, link these devices in so that they get linked into Intune so Intune can tell them what to do. All right. So hopefully this video has been instructive to you and you now have a basic idea of what Autopilot is. Now I know I haven't shown you how to use it yet in this video. I just wanted to give you a good visualization of the concepts of Autopilot. And I want to help you understand how we actually go through this process of having devices registered with Autopilot. Now remember that if I was working with an OEM like Dell or HP, they actually have the ability to upload device IDs into your environment if you let them know your domain name. All right, but you might have to do this yourself. It could be that you don't want them doing it. You could just get a spreadsheet from them with the device IDs in it, and you could upload it yourself. Or maybe you're working with a smaller OEM that doesn't have a partnership with Microsoft, and they could provide you with these device IDs, and you can put it into a CSV file and upload it yourself. All right, so that's sort of the idea here. And so what I want to show you is where this would be done. So here I am on endpoint.microsoft.com. I'm going to click on Devices. All right, and then I'm going to go to right here where it says Enroll Devices under Device Enrollment. All right, and if I scroll down just a little bit here, this is where it talks about the Windows Autopilot Deployment Program. And then if you click the Devices button here, this is where you would import it. So you could import that spreadsheet right here as a CSV file. All right. Now, you might say, well, you know, how would if I had a machine and I wanted to collect the device ID, how could I do that myself? Okay, so if you do a quick search on either Google or Bing or whatever, and there is actually a PowerShell command called get-Windows Autopilot info. You can search for that, and this is the command you can do it. But there is an article that I always like to point out. This is manually register devices with autopilot. So you can do this. You can do this with Config Manager, or you can use Windows PowerShell. In this case, we're going to look at doing this with PowerShell because we don't have Config Manager. All right, so we'll go there, and they tell you the series of commands to do this. First off, be advised that there is a command called, a script really, called get-Windows Autopilot info. Now you have to get this script. This script is located in the PowerShell gallery, which is where Microsoft stores all of the latest and greatest scripts. Now you can actually run a command that's going to let you get this script, install-script. But there's a couple things we need to do. So let's say I'm sitting at this machine here. This is the machine that I want to collect the device ID. I'm also going to show you how you would do this remotely as well. But I'm going to right click the start button here, and I'm going to go to terminal, okay, or maybe PowerShell, whichever operating system you're using, okay. And the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure scripts are allowed to be ran. Now, if you didn't know this, in PowerShell, there's a thing called the execution policy that will prevent scripts from being ran for obviously hacking reasons. But I'm going to type get-execution policy, okay? So PowerShell is just kind of lagging a little bit here. There it is. Get execution policy. So you can see right now that it's restricted. I need to change that, or if I try to install a script on this machine, it is going to block me. All right. So I'm going to type set-execution policy, and then I'm going to say -execution policy, and I'm just hitting tab to autocomplete. And then I'm going to set that to unrestricted. All right. So now if I type get execution policy, it should say unrestricted. So now I'm okay. I'm able to install this command. So, or install the script. So if I look here at the PowerShell gallery, here's the script, install-script-name get-Windows Autopilot info. I'm going to copy that and just run that command here in this PowerShell. So install-script-name get-Windows Autopilot info. All right. Now, it is going to say that in order to run scripts, it's got to basically create a folder for scripts, and it's got to create what's called a path variable, which is just a place in memory where it can remember where the scripts are. So am I sure I want to do that? Yes. I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to go ahead and allow that to happen. Now, another thing that might happen is if this is the first time you've ever downloaded anything from the PowerShell gallery, it may ask you to install something called NuGet. There it is right there. And all you got to do is say yes to that. It is okay to install NuGet. NuGet is a provider, a service provider for PowerShell that can go out and install PowerShell commands and scripts from the gallery. The next thing it tells you is that you're about to install a command from an untrusted repository. And that sounds scary. The repository is the PowerShell gallery, which is actually owned by Microsoft, oddly enough. The reason it's called a unrestricted repository, though, or untrusted repository, is because even though it's owned by Microsoft, it actually is open to the community. So people that don't work for Microsoft can upload commands. The good news is there is a moderation community as well, moderators that check these commands to make sure they aren't malicious. So for the most part, even though it says it's untrusted, you can trust it. Okay, so I've now installed that. And I'm ready to run the command that's going to let me get the device ID from a machine. Okay, so I'll just do that. I'm just going to create a folder, mkdir ID. All right, so we just created a folder. And you could have done that through File Explorer, but I just created it called ID. So now I'm going to do this. I'm going to type get-windows autopilot info.ps1. That's a PowerShell script. Now, just so you know, if I wanted to do this against computers over the network, I would type -computer name and then whatever the names of the computers are that are on the network. I could put a comma like this, and it would actually grab the device IDs for all these machines across the network. Now, in my case, I am sitting at the computer where I want to do this. Okay, so in my case, I'm just going to put -output file c:/id/device id.csv, and let's see if it works. Okay, so it looks like it did, and I'm going to open up File Explorer, and I'm going to go to C drive where it says ID, and then there is the file right there. Now, if you had Excel, you could open this up in Excel and see it, or if you don't have Excel, you can open it up in Notepad and see it. All right, so we'll just open that up in Notepad. All right, and all right, so there it is. There's a device ID, and it also has a signature hash value that just verifies mathematically that this ID is correct mathematically. So there it is right there. So now if I go back to endpoint.microsoft.com, let's do it from the start. Endpoint.microsoft.com, click devices. Okay, go here where it says enroll devices, scroll down to devices. Okay, I can now import that file, that spreadsheet. And if I had collected it from a bunch of computers, then it would have obviously worked for a bunch of computers. So I could then import that in there. And that is how we can import the device IDs into Intune. Okay, so the devices now, we register this way. A device could then in turn be reconfigured. Now in this video I was just showing you how to get to the device, to find the device ID and import the device ID. We're not actually looking at triggering Autopilot to take over machine right now. I just wanted to show you how this device ID thing works. So hopefully that all makes sense, and now you know how you can collect device IDs from machines. And by the way, I did want to add, I waited just a couple minutes so this would finish, and I did want to show you that it did finish. You could see the serial number here, manufacturer, model, because it's a virtual machine, and then it says currently the profile is not assigned. Okay, so that is the state that this will be in when it gets imported. And of course, if I had imported a bunch of these, obviously you'd have a different, these would be listed right here for you. Okay, all right, but I just wanted to quickly give you that visualization, and that is how the device IDs are going to look once they get imported. Now, when you're going to use Autopilot and you have decided to use device IDs to recognize the machines that are going to get reconfigured, there is one thing you have to set up in order for this to work before we can start utilizing deployment profiles and all that. And that is, you must have a special type of group that is going to be associated with these devices that are utilizing device ID. So just to kind of reiterate what I'm saying, if I go here on endpoint.microsoft.com and I click devices, okay, and I go down here to enroll devices, and then I go to devices under the Autopilot deployment profile, I have already imported a device ID. The problem is I need a way to recognize this utilizing what's called a deployment profile. A deployment profile is going to decide what configuration I'm going to deploy to this machine, but you have to associate that with a group. Okay, so to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to groups. All right, and we're going to click to create a new group. And this must be a security group, because security groups are the only kinds of groups that can contain devices. And then we'll just give it a name, Autopilot Managed. Okay, and the other thing that has to happen is the type of group will need to be a dynamic device, because we're going to create a little rule. Now, what if it wasn't? Well, if it wasn't, you could actually have a group that just has a bunch of devices in it, and you could tell Autopilot to manage those devices. But remember, part of the fun of Autopilot is that I'm buying a bunch of machines, perhaps, and I want these machines just to boot up and magically know that they're supposed to be managed by Autopilot. If you've already got a bunch of machines, yes, you can create a group and you can put them in those machines, or put the machine names in the group, okay? You can do that. But then you have to trigger the machines to be reset, which I'm going to we'll talk more about that coming up. So the idea here, though, is I've got brand new machines that need to be managed by Autopilot. So I'm going to do dynamic device, and then I'm going to go to add a query. All right, now if we go to Google or Bing and just do a quick search for these words, Autopilot Dynamic Security Group, Microsoft has an article that we can click on. If we scroll down, they tell you what needs to be typed here. And it's this right here, to create a group that includes all your Autopilot devices. Okay, you're going to want to put this query in right here. So I'm going to copy that. All right, copy that information that you see there. They have some other examples too, but for our needs, what we want to do is identify all the devices that have a device ID. So we'll do that. We'll copy that. And now we're going to go right here to where it says edit. We're going to paste this in, and we're going to click OK. All right, so we've now added this little rule that we need in order to make this work. Okay, so we've got everything in there. Let me just double check. I want to double check and make sure I don't have any errors here. Okay, so any errors? No, I think all of this is correct. So I think we should be okay. All right, so everything should be correct, and then I'm going to click save, and then I'm going to click to create this group. All right, so we've now officially got the group that we need in order for Autopilot profiles to be able to detect any devices that we have associated device IDs with. Now I want to show you the creation of a deployment profile. All right, so this is an out-of-box experience deployment profile that can be managed by Intune. So we'll go right here. I'm just going to open up a new tab for this, and that's going to bring us here into devices. All right, and I'm going to go to enroll devices. All right, and here we have deployment profiles. Okay, now notice one thing I do want to point out that I think is very important to understand here is that Autopilot is only available for Windows. It is not available for any other operating system. Okay, so this is why we have selected the blade here where it says Windows Enrollment. It is only available. Autopilot is a feature that's only available for Windows, and basically it's Windows 10 and higher are the only operating systems that supported it. So we'll go to Deployment Profiles, and now we're ready to click to create a profile. We're going to go with Windows PC here. All right, and we'll give it a name. Okay, we'll just call this Autopilot Demo. All right, and then it does say, do you want to convert all targeted devices to Autopilot? So this would be if I was using a group. Usually what you do is, like, if you had a group that you had associated here on the assignments tab, we haven't got there yet, but if you had a group that you had associated on the assignments tab, it would automatically make them all Autopilot devices if you did this. If you choose yes to that. Okay, so they're telling you right here, select yes to register all targeted devices to Autopilot if they are not already registered. So if they don't already have device IDs, then you could go ahead and make them support Autopilot. It says the next time registered devices go through the out-of-box experience, they'll go through the Autopilot server. So what is that saying? Well, if you associated a group over here on the assignments tab that had, let's say, 50 Windows devices that are part of that group, okay? And these are like 50 devices that are already in use by people, okay? And you said yes to this. You're basically going to make them all Autopilot devices. But really, to be honest with you, nothing's going to happen unless you trigger the out-of-box experience by performing a reset on those devices, okay? So that's all that means, all right? In my case, my device is a device ID. I could leave this set to yes or no. It doesn't really matter, and I'm going to end up with the same outcome. All right, so let's take a look at this. And just so you know, this screen changes. It feels like it changes every week. So I would not be surprised if it looks a little different if you're watching this video, just because it's like it seems like it changes every week. But anyway, so how is this? We have a deployment mode. We can do user-driven or self-deployment. User-driven means that the user will have a little bit more control over the out-of-box experience. They'll have a little bit more control over the out-of-box experience than they would if you chose self-deployment. You'll notice that if you choose self-deployment, some of the stuff gets grayed out. Okay. So they don't get to change or mess with any of this stuff. I'm going to do user driven, and then it says, do you want to show the, and then it says join Azure AD. So I can say join Azure AD, or if I want to do hybrid, I can have a hybrid domain join if I want. I'll just leave it set to join Azure AD right now. It says Microsoft software terms. Do you want to show the terms and make the user accept those, or do you want to hide them? Now keep in mind, if you choose hide, you're basically accepting the terms on behalf of the user. Privacy, same thing. You choose hide, you're accepting on behalf of the user. This right here, hide change account options, I highly recommend you don't allow a user to choose if they're going to be an admin. Okay, so I can go with that, hide, or the default type of user that will be on this machine will be a standard user. Okay. The next thing available here is the allow pre-provisioned deployment option. This used to be called the white glove feature. This is a scenario in which if you had a bunch of machines that needed to be reset very quickly, you can have software and everything just already installed on the machine. And so what this basically does is it says, hey, when you run Autopilot, I don't want to wipe any of those applications. Let's just keep everything in there. I'm not going to get into a lot of depth on that. You can research that a little bit more, and you can learn how to configure and set that up. But I'm not really getting into that in this video. But that's what this is going to do for us. Here I've got language, region, so I can set that to whatever I want. If I want to go with language default there, I can. And then you can set keyboard, automatically set the keyboard to yes or no, or let the user choose, or the user will have an opportunity to change it if you do user driven anyway. And then finally, you can have a device name template. So whatever you want this device to be called. So I want to set this to, whatever I want this device to be named, I can do that. All right. So I can enter in a name here. Now, what you can do is you can put something like the name of your company, exam lab practice in my case, and then you could do like what they show as the example. You say, give it a random number. So I can say ELP-% rand :5%. That's going to generate a 5-digit random number. Okay. Now generally speaking, you do want to have some kind of a, unique name that that you go with. Okay. I'm just going to put this in here because I've just got one machine that I'm doing this with. All right. So I'll click next, and then this is where I'm going to set assignments. So I'm going to click to add a group. All right. And the group I'm going to put is the Autopilot managed group. And you'll notice you can do exclusion groups. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on that right now. Generally speaking, anytime in Intune, though, you have what's called an included group and an excluded group. Excluded groups always override included groups. So if you had a scenario where a device or a user was a member of both groups, it would get excluded. If you added, if I had, like, let's say I had a group called sales and another group called marketing, and I had, a device that was a member of both groups, well, it would get excluded. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. This video is not really explaining that in detail, but I'm just adding an included group here, and that's going to be the Autopilot managed group. At that point, we're going to click next, and we're going to click create. We've now created our profile. Okay, something else that I want to do that is necessary, I want to make sure that what is known as auto enrollment is turned on and within our Autopilot environment. If this is a new version of Intune, it may not be. So this is something that that we definitely have to keep in mind. So if I go over here to devices, and I go to enroll devices, I want to go here to automatic enrollment, and I just want to make sure that that this is set to all for MDM and all for MAM, and I need to click save. Now again, if this is a new Intune environment for you, these are probably set to none, so you need to turn that on. Okay. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to portal.azure.com. It's going to bring me over to Azure. I want to take a look at Azure Active Directory. So once I get to portal.azure, I'm going to click the menu button and go to Azure Active Directory. All right, and I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to go here where it says company branding. All right, and so right here, it asks me what I want the sign-in experience to look like when somebody signs in. Default sign-in, I can customize what it's going to look like. I can add a logo and stuff like that. In my case, you know, I'm not going to add any kind of a logo or any of that stuff. But you could if you want to add a color, background, any of that. So let's see if there's anything else. There's sign-in form, banners, a logo. So I do want to add some sign-in text. I'm going to say, welcome to exam lab practice. So I am going to put that. And then I'm going to click review and create. And click create. So when somebody is setting up, if their machine's being logged in to this through Autopilot, it should say welcome to exam lab practice. All right. So at that point, we have now finished setting up our profile for Autopilot. We've created a group, created our profile, and so that is how you're going to go through that process of setting up a Autopilot deployment profile. I'd like to show you another feature we have in regards to Intune and Autopilot, known as the enrollment status page. So to look at this, we got to go to endpoint.microsoft.com, and we're going to click on devices. All right, if we click on enroll devices, this is where you'll see that we have this enrollment status page button. So we'll click on that, and you can see that by default, we just have a default enrollment status page configuration that's set to all users and all devices. Okay, so this is just assigned to everybody. Now, if we wanted to, we could create separate page profiles and assign those to specific groups, users, devices, whatever they may be. Okay, or we can edit the default one. I'll click on properties here, and you can see that this is going to tie to all users. And I click on settings. Right now, it says the enrollment page appears during the initial device setup and during first user sign-in. If enabled, users can see the configuration process of assigned apps and profiles targeted to their device. Show app and profile configuration progress. So currently it's set to no, which means it's not showing any progress when a user is waiting on things to get installed. So with like Autopilot, when this is all being deployed, they're not getting any kind of progress information. I can click yes, and then I can answer certain questions like show an error when installation takes longer than 60 minutes, show custom messages if you want, turn on log collection diagnostics, only show page to devices provisioned by out-of-box experience, block device use until all apps and profiles are installed, so you can make it where they can't log on. So there's various things here you can do. Allow user to reset device during the installation if it errors, allow user to use device if installation errors, block device use until required apps are installed if they are assigned to the user or device. So you can go through here and you can save all of this if you want. So the other thing I can do is if I want to just configure this again for a specific group, I could click create, and I'll say, you know, just NYC client 11, if that's the name of your machine. Go to settings, set this to what you want. So I can go through here and, you know, set this to yes, 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 specify, you know, whatever I want to enable here. And then click next, and then I would just assign it to that group, right? So I have that Autopilot group, click select, click next. You can specify something called admin scope tags. So I'm not really going to get into the details here. This is for admins though, what they can see. But we'll click next and click create. And at that point, you'll see this has a priority 1. So this will override the default. And if I created another one, you can move up, move down the priority. Okay. And so that's how that's going to work. All right. So that is what the enrollment status page is. Nothing spectacular, but it can provide some information and also a couple extra features for a user if they get an error. Okay, so here I am back on this machine. This is the machine that I gathered the device ID for. We have already added that device ID right here in the Autopilot. Okay, we've created a group for our Autopilot, and we've also created a deployment profile, an out-of-box experience deployment profile. So if we go and we look back here on enroll devices and deployment profiles, we have our deployment profile right here. So now what I'm going to do on this machine is I am going to right click the start button, click run, and I'm going to type sysprep. This is going to trigger this machine to go into the out-of-box experience. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, click OK, and we're going to trigger this to happen. Now keep in mind, if this was a new machine that you just bought and you just plugged it in, this new machine would already be set to the out-of-box experience. So it could just be plugged in, booted up, and it should work. So let's go ahead and click OK. Okay, so this is just right in the middle of this machine going through the process of the sysprep and the reboot, and I just check it in. I'm going to pause the recording while this loads through. Okay, so I want you to notice that it says welcome to exam lab practice. So there's our little banner sign-in text, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my credentials here. All right, so it should be able to authenticate. And I will go ahead and pause the recording while this is processing. Okay, now notice that it is showing some progress. It's showing the device preparation, device setup, and account setup. So we will just wanted to show you this progress. And of course, this process obviously does take some time, and I'm kind of speeding through, pausing the recording and all of that so that you're not having to wait. But just know that this does take some time. All right, so the next thing it says after it runs through the 3 sections, you'll notice it says this may take a few minutes. It says don't turn off the PC, so this is the next little step that's happening. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording and let this process through. Okay, so here I am on the logon screen. My resolution is a little bit small, but I'm going to go ahead now and authenticate, putting in my credentials, and let that process through here. But the machine has been reset, and everything did work as it was supposed to. So we've now got this machine set up and linked with the help of Autopilot, and the device should be showing up inside of Intune. Something else I can do is go here to settings, and once I get into settings, I'll just go right here and just search for the word work. All right, this lets me basically find the workplace or school or access work or school. So I'll click on that. All right, you can see that it is connected to exam lab practice. Now I will tell you that I did not, when I was setting up the deployment profile, I did not tell it to join the domain. So currently it is not joined to my Microsoft Active Directory domain, but I don't really need that right now. All I wanted was for it to be joined to Azure Active Directory, and that's kind of what I wanted out of this demonstration. So we are good to go on that. Jumping back into endpoint.microsoft.com now, I just wanted to show you a couple things. First off, if I click on devices and I go to Windows, you can see that my new device has been added. This is an older device, don't worry about that. This is my new device. I haven't done any kind of compliance checking on it, so you'll see it is not evaluated, but it is showing up, this NYC client 11B, which is what I named it. And if I jump back over to devices again and I go to enroll devices and I look at right here where it says autopilot deployment program, go to devices there. Okay, you'll see that the device ID says assigned now as the status, right? So that is doing exactly what we expected it to. And then if I come back over here to enroll devices deployment profiles, I can also see that this is the assigned deployment profile, and I can even see the assigned devices that it's associated with, which is that serial number there. Okay. All right. So that hopefully now helps you with have a good understanding of this whole process with setting up the autopilot and going through the visualization of the actual profile being deployed to a machine. I'd now like to get into troubleshooting and autopilot deployment. So the first thing to be aware of here is that there's some various concepts that you want to be familiar with if you're going to troubleshoot Autopilot. Microsoft has kind of designed all of this in a way that they provide you with some fundamental principles to keep in mind. One being the understanding of the Windows Autopilot process flow, how the process flow works. The second being how Windows Autopilot device profiles are downloaded, and the last being the key activities performed during the troubleshooting process itself. Now, we're going to take a look at these steps here coming up. First, I want you to be aware of, though, the fact that one thing that can be very helpful if you're trying to get a machine enrolled into Autopilot and maybe the machine's booting up, if you have enabled the enrollment status page, which you should be familiar with, then you can enable the ability for diagnostic information to be shown for the user. So you can actually go to the enrollment status page profile through Autopilot diagnostic pages in the endpoint.microsoft.com portal, and then from there you can make sure that the show app and profile configuration process is set to yes, and then you can turn on log collection. What's neat about that is if something's going wrong, if the Autopilot on the machine is starting to enroll and it has a problem, you can actually hit Control-Shift-D and you can view that diagnostic information. So it could really help you with troubleshooting. Okay, all right. So the next would be looking at the actual flow here. So first thing is, whether you're performing user-driven or self-deployment device deployments, here's something to keep in mind. First would be a network connection is established. So if there's a problem with Autopilot, the starting point with the machine is making sure there's a network connection, whether it be Wi-Fi or Ethernet. The next, making sure that the Autopilot profile is downloaded. This is, the key there is if you don't have an actual profile associated with the machine, either by the device ID or you've got a group with the devices specifically tied to it, then there's no way for a profile to be downloaded to begin with. So we got to make sure that that's there and that that's something that's possible. Another thing is if the profile is getting downloaded, then it should be prompting for a user authentication. At that point, user needs to put their credentials in, and those got to be validated. All right. Next would be Azure Active Directory join occurs, so it's going to join into Azure Active Directory. We want to make sure there's no problems there. There's no reason why it shouldn't, be able to join Azure Active Directory. After Azure Active Directory is joined by the machine, that process will take you into it, or the machine will go into actually joining Intune itself. And of course, that's where the magic happens. Intune can then begin deploying settings and everything else out. So settings can be applied. And so it's sort of a step-by-step, making sure there's network connectivity, make sure there's a profile associated with the machine, make sure user authentication is occurring, it's joining Azure Active Directory, it's going to automatically join through MDM. This is why it's important to make sure through endpoint.microsoft.com that we've enabled the auto enrollment, which you should already know how to do that. Okay. Next will be the profile download. So we want to make sure the profile gets downloaded. So as long as the machine has an internet connection, it should automatically connect to the Autopilot service, and it should be able to download a profile. So we got to make sure that we have a profile set up and that it's associated with the machine through the device ID, or the machine is directly tied into a group that's associated with the profile. All right. There's a little note here. It tells you that it says at this stage it's important that Autopilot profiles exist, so that there's not like a blank profile. That a blank profile isn't being locally cached. And it says if necessary, you can retrieve a new Autopilot profile simply by rebooting. And then it tells you here you can hit Shift F10 on the keyboard, or you can type the commands if you're a command prompt. All right. So lastly here, I want to look at the key troubleshooting activities. All right, first being review your configuration. Make sure you're understanding how things are supposed to be configured. You've got your Intune services set up. You've gone into endpoint.microsoft.com. You've set up your group. You have made sure device IDs are there. All right, so make sure you understand what your requirements are for the configuration. All right. Check network connectivity. Make sure there is connectivity with the machine. Make sure it's got an internet connection. Autopilot out-of-the-box experience behavior. So the out-of-box experience screen should be getting displayed. If it's not, then perhaps the machine was not set to go to the out-of-box experience. Maybe somebody's already used the machine previously and answered all the out-of-box experience questions. You could do a sysprep, or you could do a device reset or Windows reset in order to re-trigger that if you needed to. If there's any, as far as Azure AD join issues, you're going to make sure that the device is able to join Azure AD. Is it, what operating system are we dealing with here? And are we dealing with an Azure AD user? His user credentials, you can't be using like a local user account for this. It'd have to be either an Azure AD user account or a hybrid domain user that has both a domain user account as well as an Azure AD user account. Then you got MDM enrollment issues. So maybe it's trying to enroll, it joins Azure AD first, then it's going to join Intune second. That's your MDM enrollment. So is the device able to roll into Intune or some other MDM service? Okay. The final thing to keep in mind is that it does generate log informations that you can view inside the monitoring services of Intune, which I'm not getting into a whole lot right now, but you do have some logging data that you can look at, all right, that could assist you with troubleshooting if need be, all right. So those are going to be the key things you want to remember in regards to troubleshooting autopilot issues in Microsoft Intune. I'd like to now help you understand the concepts of roles as how they pertain to Microsoft Intune. Now, if you're doing anything pretty much in Azure, you should be aware that roles are how we will give rights out to users or admins. In this case, when it comes to Intune, we're specifically focused on giving rights out to admins so that admins can control and do the various actions that are needed in order to maintain or manage your environment. But the starting point to this is definitely going to be Azure AD. I want to kind of show you a little bit about that. If we actually go to Google or Bing and just search for Intune roles, if you do a quick look, you'll see there's an article called RBAC within Microsoft Intune. RBAC is role-based access control, which of course is what Azure and Intune and all of that uses. And the key thing I wanted to get across to you, the thing I want you to remember right out of the gates here, is they tell you that you must be either a global administrator or an Intune service administrator in order to create, edit, or assign roles. So what are they talking about? Well, if we go back over to portal.azure.com, we click the menu button here and go to Azure Active Directory. We're going to click on Roles and Administrators, and this is where your general roles are all at regarding just Active Directory, or Azure Active Directory, I should say. Of course, the Global Administrator role is the most powerful role you can have in Azure AD. You, as I like to say, just about have intergalactic cosmic powers over Azure AD if you have this role assignment. All right, but the other thing they mentioned is the Intune Service Administrator role. Okay, so if we look over here and we scroll down a little bit here, you will see that we have this Intune Administrator. That essentially is our Intune Service Administrator. So it's labeled a little differently here, but we are the the Intune Administrator being the Intune Service Administrator. In fact, if we go back over here to this article where it says Intune Service Administrator, you'll notice it says also known as Intune Administrator. Okay, so anybody that you want to have control over Intune, full control over Intune, you can give them that right without having to give them the Global Administrator privilege. Now, I am a Global Administrator, so I don't have to do that for myself. But I did want to point that out. All right. So now I want to go over to endpoint.microsoft.com, and we want to take a look at roles related to Intune specifically, okay? So to do that, we're going to go right here to this blade called Tenant Administration, all right? And then you'll see a blade called Roles, and this is where your roles are going to be specifically to Intune. Now, I'm not going to go over each and every single one of these roles, but I encourage you to take some time and just kind of click on each one of these click the properties, just read the description, and then go down here to where it says properties, and you can kind of skim through the different rights that someone is going to have if they have these various roles. Okay, so just familiarize yourself a little bit with these roles. I encourage you to do that. All right, and the next thing I want to explain is if we wanted to create a role that was specific to a certain area of our company or a certain department or whatever it may be. Like, for example, let's say that we were in New York City in the United States and we had an office in New York City, and we only wanted certain admins to be able to manage devices that are in the New York City office of our environment. Well, by default, if you're an Intune administrator, you can do whatever you want, but what we might want to do is make it where if you're a New York City admin, you can only manage devices and see devices that are tied to New York City. The way that we go about doing that in regards to roles is with what is known as scope tags. Now, if you've played around in Intune, or maybe you've seen me play around in Intune, you've noticed there's a scope tags area. And this is the area this is where I'd like to actually explain scope tags to you. So if I click on scope tags, you're going to notice there is a default scope tag. It says by default all Intune entities without a scope tag are assigned to the built-in default. So everything by default is tied to this one, which means anybody who's involved in Intune that has been given rights can see everything, because everything is tied to default. Now, if you read what it says here, it tells you that scope tags define groups of Intune resources that align with specific Intune role assignments. Here's a good example. A Seattle office scope tag could be used to associate policies, profiles, applications with administrators that only apply to the Seattle office location. So I could click create, and I'll just call this New York. All right. And we'll label that as just a New York scope tag. We'll click next. Now I can assign a group of users that will essentially be able to work with objects that are associated with this scope tag. All right. So you might have a group called New York admins or something along those lines, and you want the New York admins to be able to see all this. Now, I don't actually have a group called that, so why don't we create one? I'll just right-click Groups over here, open with a new new tab. Now, you could just jump over to Azure AD and do this, but ultimately it doesn't matter. You can create it from within here or Azure AD. It all ties to the same place. So we'll click New Group. All right. It can be a security group or a Microsoft 365 group in this case, but because we're going to be pointing to users. And I'll just call this New York admins. Okay. And we would then specify our members, whoever those users are going to be, right? So I could select these users. And again, I don't know if you're doing this with me or not, but it doesn't matter if you don't have all these users. Just, create some users if you want. It doesn't really matter. The main thing that matters is I'm going to put myself in this. I'm going to put, JC, John Christopher in there. All right, so there we go. We'd select and we'd click create. Now we've done it, right? So we're good to go there. Let's jump back over here. Now we'll click add the assignment. We'll search for the word New York. There's New York admins. We'll click select. And again, it does not matter if you got the same groups as me. Don't worry about any of that. I just created this New York admins group right in front of you. We'll click next. And then at that point, we'll click review and create. All right. Now, the benefit here of doing this is that we can tag certain objects as we go through and we work inside of Intune. We can tag certain objects as scoped with New York, which means if you had another scope, like let's say I had another scope called Dallas, okay, we could tie that to some other group or whatever. the Dallas admins would not be able to manage any objects that didn't have that Dallas tag. In fact, they wouldn't be able to manage any of the New York objects, and the New York admins wouldn't be able to manage any of the Dallas objects. That's the idea of that. Okay, this is to help you with managing your admin levels. Now, if you're in a smaller environment, you'll just leave it default. If you don't have different levels of admins, I wouldn't go through the trouble of working with scope tags. This is mainly for larger environments that have different admins that are in different places, and they want to be able to control those admins. So that's the idea of scope tags. Now let's go back over here to all roles, and let's try creating a role. We're going to create our own role instead of using one of the traditional roles that are here. So we'll click create. All right. And then from there, we'll call this New York Intune Admins. All right, so we're creating this custom role. We're going to click next. And so then the permissions would be whatever permissions you want to give them. So what rights do you want to give them? And so there are all these rights that you could give these New York admins if you wanted. So like I could do, let's do compliance. And we'll set all the compliance setup of policies. We'll do device configuration that will allow them to do. If you're not sure what some of these are, you can always highlight over that. Make them device enrollment manager support. Maybe they can grab analytic data. So there's just lots and lots of stuff here that we could allow them to do or not allow them to do if we wanted, right? And so then I'm going to click next, and so then this is how we're going to tie this to a scope tag. So we're going to go select scope tag, we'll select New York, then there you go. We're going to remove the default one. So New York admins won't be able to mess with all the default stuff if we don't want them to. Okay, or if you've done a really good job of making sure you've tagged everything as you've worked in your Azure environment or your Intune environment, then you would be able to go through and you could leave the default one on there, and just anything that was default would be like general purposes, right? So that's the idea there. So then we would click create, we'd click create again, and there you go. So we've got this New York admins role. We can now assign it if we want. So we click assign. All right. So we want to assign this. It says add the role assignment. We'll say New York admins assignment. Click next. All right. And then at that point, which admin groups do we want to give this role to? So we're going to do that to the New York admins, right? And then we'll click next. And then at this point, if you want, you could go ahead and just in any groups that you want to create pertaining to users and devices that they can manage, you can add those, or you could say all users. Now, if you've done scope tags, all right, if you've gone through and you've set scope tags, then you could say all users. You could say all devices. As long as things are properly tagged as you've gone through and worked inside of Intune, you could do that. Or if you wanted to go the route of creating a group specific to your devices that pertain to New York, you can do that as well. Okay? Like I've got a group, if I do a search called New York, I've got a group called New York users and devices. You may not have that group, but you can create one. And you would insert all your users and all your devices in New York. But technically, if you've tagged everything inside of Intune, as you worked inside of Intune, then you can just do the set to all and then make sure that you select scope tag New York. All right. And then at that point, we click next and we click create. And we've now done our role assignment. So New York admins are now given this New York admins role assignment. So let me give you an example here of using this with an object. Let's go over to the devices blade here, and if I click on Windows, I have a device, this NYCL 11B device, and if I click on that, all right, if we go to Properties, you'll see it says Scope Tags, and currently it's tied to the default, but we're going to tie it to New York. All right. And at that point, if we want to remove it from the default, we can. By removing it from default, that means that it would not be seen by admins who are just tied to the default. That's the idea. Okay. So hopefully you now have a decent understanding. And if you wanted to try to create some users and log on and see what you can see and can't, you're welcome to do that. But hopefully this video has given you an understanding of the role-based access control in regards to scopes involving Microsoft Intune. I'd now like to talk about enrollment to Azure Active Directory, and I'm also going to talk about this in regards to Intune as well. We'll start with Azure AD. So here we are on portal.azure.com, and if we go over here to the menu button and we go to Azure Active Directory, we can click on Devices, and we can see what devices are already joined. By clicking on all devices, we can see what devices are already joined. Now, keep something in mind. I've used my Azure Active Directory environment here to teach multiple courses, so you may not see the exact same machines in your case if you're looking at your environment. But the one I really care about right now is this guy right here. He's been enrolled in NYCCL 11, and he was actually enrolled with the help of Intune, and that was done through Autopilot in the case where I deployed that box using Autopilot. But I also want to point out that you can manually join devices to Azure AD as well as auto enrollment. Now I'll show you the manual way first, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the automated ways. So I'm going to show you from the perspective of the machine that I am physically sitting at right now. All right. If I hit Start, this is and hit Settings. This is a Windows 10 machine, and let me just expand this out where you can see it a little bit better here. I can just do a search for the word work, or if you want to click Accounts in this case and go to Access Work or School. From there, I can click Connect, and it'll let me authenticate to Azure Active Directory. Okay. Now I don't actually want to join the computer that I'm physically sitting at right now to my environment. The other thing to understand is when you join Azure AD, you can in turn have it automatically join you to Intune. Or, believe it or not, it is possible to tell it just to join Intune, join MDM. But I will warn you, if you are using Microsoft Intune, you're not using a third party. If you join Intune, it's going to automatically join you to Azure AD. Okay, now, if you are using a third party MDM product, then it is possible to join that other MDM product without being part of Azure AD. Okay, in this case though, I can go right here to where it says enroll only in device management. That would allow me to join into Intune. Okay, but when I join into Intune, in my case, since I am using Intune, it's going to automatically join my device to Azure AD as well. Now you might say, well, what if we don't have Intune? What if we just have Azure AD? Is that possible? Yeah, absolutely. Nobody has to use Intune. Intune brings to the table a lot of capabilities and a lot of features that are wonderful, from the ability to inventory devices, to using Autopilot to reprovision devices, to changing the configuration of a device by reprovisioning it, to deploying applications, to remote help. I mean, there's so many things. Deploying updates. There is lots of things Intune can do. But you may not want Intune, you may not have Intune in your environment, so can you essentially join Azure AD and not have Intune? Well, absolutely. And with that, you can still deploy something called conditional access policies out to people's devices and things like that. So I want you to know there are some things you can do just through Azure AD that doesn't involve Intune. But if you really want the power of controlling devices, you're going to probably want to have Intune, okay? But this is how I could join it. I could put my credentials in and I could authenticate. Now, let me jump over to my box here that's joined, this NYC 11 here. If I hit Start and we go to Settings, this being a Windows 11 box here, And if I just do a quick search for the word work, you can see Access Worker School. If I click that, you can see that it is connected to Exam Lab Practice. Okay, so you can see this box was connected. And how did it get connected? Well, it got connected with the help of, in my case, Autopilot. So I did an Autopilot deployment, and that's how this got connected, is through Autopilot. All right. Now, I would like to talk about some of the automated methods. In fact, I just spoke about one automated method that a device can be joined just now, and that was through Autopilot. Now, I will also warn you that to support the auto enrollment features for all this, to have a device automatically enrolled, you do have to turn on the automatic enrollment feature. And if you come over to, let's go back over to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go down here to Azure Active Directory, okay? And if we scroll down, there is a blade called Mobility. We click on that Mobility blade, and then you can see it's going to say, okay, well, which MDM product are you using? In my case, I'm using Intune. There are third-party products out there, but we only care about Intune here. So I'm going to click on Intune, and you can see that auto enrollment is already turned on in my case. Now, just so you know, in a new environment, this will be set to none. Both of these will be set to none. So I am basically supporting MDM for both user configuration of MDM devices, that's mobile device management, as well as MAM, mobile application management. Now let me show you something else. You will see this exact same screen if you go to endpoint.microsoft.com. So let's jump over there. This is the Intune. This is Intune. All right. And we click Devices. And then we're going to click on Enroll Devices. All right. And then here it is, Automatic Enrollment. Okay, which says configure Windows devices to enroll when they join or register Azure AD. That is already set to all. Now, as long as the user who is joining Azure AD has an Intune license, their device will automatically be joined to Intune. Okay, which in my case, if I go back and I look at my user account here, which is jc@examlabpractice.com. Actually, let me do it over here. All right. We click on that user and we look at licenses. All right. And if I look, this is the license that gives this to me, Enterprise Mobility plus Security. So if I click on that, you can see I do have an Intune license. All right. So that's what makes all that work. So again, the automatic enrollment has to be turned on. Okay. That's key. And if you do a Autopilot deployment, then the device will automatically join Azure AD as well as Intune. But there are some other methods I already mentioned, and if you do a quick Google search or Bing search on joining Azure AD, there's various documents you'll find. Here's one of them, Azure AD join a new Windows device. They kind of show you the concept here. This is Windows 11. They're showing you here joining. Okay. And then if you come over here and do another search on automatic enrollment, this is what they're showing you, what I just explained to you, step by step. Of course, if you do a search for automatic enrollment, you may start here on step 4, but basically you'll see that they've got them broken out into steps. Sign up for Intune, create a user in Intune to assign a license. You know, you can create a group to manage it if you want. And then finally you get to this step, which is what I was just showing you, which is making sure you turned on this automatic enrollment capability. Okay. And then at that point, you have the ability to enroll devices manually. In our case, if I manually enrolled in Azure AD, it's going to automatically enroll me into Intune. That's the key. So it's kind of confusing because you're like, well, wait a minute, you're going to manually enroll it, but it's automatic. Well, if you manually enroll in Azure AD, it'll automatically enroll you in Intune. If you manually enroll it in Intune, it'll automatically enroll you into Azure AD. Either way, you're going to end up in Azure AD unless you're using third party. Okay. So then it talks about device compliance and all that. But what is another way that a device can automatically be enrolled, and how can that happen? Well, group policies. If you do a quick Google or Bing search on enroll Windows using group policies, and I know this is Windows 10, but it doesn't have to be just Windows 10. You can use group policies to do that. All right. Got to make sure this is kind of an old screenshot they're showing you. They haven't updated this page. This isn't what it looks like anymore, right? Doesn't look like that anymore. It looks, let me go back to devices. Let's go back to Windows. Didn't mean to do that, sorry. Devices, and then enroll devices, and then automatic enrollment. This is what it looks like. But again, and I know I've said this before, but let me say it again. Let me remind you, because I get messaged all the time about this. Somebody will message me and say, hey, the screen looks a little different. This is just something you got to get used to, everybody. Microsoft changes the way the screens look. It feels like every single week. The other thing that they do is they rename things like every week. So it's like right now this is called the Microsoft Intune Admin Center. Next week they may call it the Admin Intune Center. They may change it. They may completely change the name Intune altogether. It would not surprise me. You know, they were calling it the Endpoint Manager Intune Admin Center and all that. So they're constantly changing. But these screens change, and that's just our life as admins. We got to get used to that. You just got to get used to change. It is what it is. The days of things changing only once every 3 years, the interface is changing like every 3 years, that's gone. We're living in a world now where Microsoft changes the screens and the names of things weekly. All right. And they do mention that when a device is joined, there is a command line tool called dsreg cmd/status you can run, and it'll show you if it's Azure AD join, domain join. I will warn you, this command though, when you join, it doesn't always update very fast. I've seen it can take hours. It could even take 24 hours before this properly shows up in command prompt. So I don't put a lot of stock in this command, but I would be aware that it does exist. dsreg cmd/status will tell you on a computer if it's join, domain join, all that stuff. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right. Now, if I wanted to deploy a group policy in a domain that auto-joined my devices, this little section here is what tells us how to do that. All right. So you'll notice that it's telling you that you can go into group policy objects and you can enable this automatic enrollment feature. Let me jump over to my domain controller and I'll show you how we could deploy this out into our domain. It's actually pretty easy. So I'll just go over to NYC DC1, which is my domain controller. We'll first go into Azure AD Connect, because if we want our devices to be able to auto join Azure AD and then of course in turn join Intune, we have to enable that through here. It's actually pretty easy. We'll just double click on Azure AD Connect, pull this up, click configure. We're going to go right here to configure device options. Next, it mentions hybrid Azure AD join listed here. So we're going to click next. We're going to go ahead and authenticate to the cloud. Make sure I didn't typo that. There we go. All right, so it's just authenticating. Okay, we're going to configure hybrid Azure AD join. Next, it says select the operating systems. We'll do Windows 10 and later. Click next. All right, examlabpractice.com. Authentication type will be that. And then for enterprise admin, we can put in our enterprise admin credentials. Exam Lab Practice /administrator. Oops, I think I typoed that. There we go. Click OK. All right, and then we'll click Next. Checking for installed components now. And it says once you click configure, we will do the following. So that's fine. We'll hit configure, and it's going to go ahead and start synchronizing that information out there to Azure AD and all that. So it now says that we have completed that successfully. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to jump in and see how we configure the MDM side of this in order for this to work with group policies and all of that. So now we'll go to Server Manager, which if you don't know how to get to Server Manager, just hit Start and you'll see Server Manager. So then I'll go to Tools and I'll go to Group Policy Management. This is the place where group policies can be deployed, which is what's going to control settings in our domain. And then I'll go down here after expanding all this out to group policy objects. I'll just create a new GPO, new group policy object, that I'm just going to call Auto Enrollment. All right, click OK to that, right click that and click Edit. At that point, I will go under Computer Configuration Administrative Templates, and then Windows Components, and then MDM, which is exactly where they tell you to go in that document that you just saw. So then I'll go right here. It says Enable Automatic and MDM Enrollment. I'll double click on that and I'll click Enable. Then we'll use User Credentials. Now, it does tell you can use an MDM application ID, but they also tell you that this is only needed if you're using, they tell you this is optional and only required for automatic MDM enrollment using device credentials when multiple MDM applications are configured in Azure AD. So if your company was using Intune and something else, that's when you would worry about this. We aren't, so we're going to leave that alone. We're going to click OK, and at that point we've got this enabled in the policy. We would now just need to drag it over whatever devices we want. Maybe the devices are going to be the New York office, or if you wanted every device in the domain to have to join, then you would put it on the domain, and at that point it would be turned on. Okay. Keep in mind that policies can take 90 to 120 minutes on machines to get refreshed. So now if we have a user that is authenticating with the domain and then also it's being synchronized into Azure AD, as long as they have an Azure AD license, then they can be automatically joined. So for example, if I come over here to Active Directory users and computers, which of course you can get there by going to Server Manager and opening it up right there. If I go there and I have a little OU called Cloud Sync, which is where my users are that are being synchronized to the cloud. And if I create a new user, all right, let's create a new user and we'll just call this Test Auto Join User. So Test Auto Join. All right, and we'll give it a password. Password doesn't have to be changed. All right, we'll click Next, we'll click Finish. And we got to allow that to be synchronized to Azure AD. All right, so you do kind of have to give that some time, and Azure AD will synchronize it out there. Now, if we jump over to portal.azure.com and click the menu button, go down here to Azure Active Directory, click on our users, we should see that our user has synchronized. Let's just search for the word test. There it is, Test Auto Join. Now, if the user didn't synchronize, there's usually reasons for that. The first thing you want to do is you want to check to make sure your services, your Azure AD Connect services are running. So you'd have to go to your domain controller or whatever server is doing Azure AD Connect, and you want to right click, go to Computer Management, and then click on Services, and then make sure this service right here is running. Another thing you can do is you can force your Azure AD Sync to synchronize if you go to PowerShell. So there is a PowerShell command that you can run called start-AD sync sync cycle policy type delta, and this will force it to run. So you don't have to wait on it to run. It can sometimes take 15 minutes to an hour to run if you don't do that. But as you can see, the user account is there, so I'm just going to click Test Auto Join, and we'll go to Licenses, and then we're going to go to Assignments, and we're going to give the Enterprise Mobility Plus Security license to this user, which of course gives us the Azure AD as well as Intune license. Oh, and also if you get this failed message, I just remembered by this error, if you get that failed message, it means you have to give the user a usage location. All licenses have to have a usage location associated to it, so let's fix that real quick. We'll go over here to users, we'll go to our test user, and let's set this to, let's go ahead and me test auto join, edit properties, and this is another screen that changes like every week. So it's like I come in here and I have to have to find how they've changed things recently. But yeah, this is another one. So anyway, we're going to scroll down right here on this all tab, and we're going to go to usage location. In my case, I'm going to put United States. Okay, and then I'm going to click save. Now we should be able to assign a license. So assignment, enterprise ability plus security, save. License assignment failed. Let's find out why it failed. License operator. Oh, I don't have enough licenses. That's right, because John Christopher has the only license that I've got available. Now, if you're doing a trial, then you will have multiple licenses, so you won't have this problem. But in my case, I've only got one license, so I can actually, I'll just temporarily take away the John Christopher license from that admin account, from the auto join account. All right. So how can we do that? Go to Azure AD. Go to users, find JC, licenses, and enterprise. All right, and we'll just say remove the license. Okay, so we'll just remove this license from John Christopher. So let's go double check. Azure AD and all products. Enterprise ability plus security. Yeah, total. Okay. So let's go add user and groups, and we will go and put the word test in, test auto join, click select, click review and assign, and click assign. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to I have this Windows 11 box that is joined to the domain, but it is not joined to Azure AD. Okay. In fact, I can prove that if I go to settings, search for the word work, access work or school, and you can see that it is joined to the domain, but it is not joined to Azure AD. See, it does not say anything about Azure AD here, and it allows me to connect. So it does not. So what we're going to do, we're going to sign out of this this machine. Here we are, and we're going to sign out of it. So sign out, and we will sign in as our user. So that user we created, which is this test auto join user, that's going to be its username right there, test auto join. Okay. So let's jump back over to Windows 11. Okay, and we'll say other user, and we'll do exam lab practice / test auto join. Put the password in. And this is going to take a couple of minutes because this is the first time the user's ever logged on, so it's going to take a minute to create the profile. So I'll just go ahead and pause the recording while that's happening. Once I get logged on, I should be able to hit Start Settings and go right here to Accounts, and then let's look at Access Worker School, and there we go. So it should show that we are joined, and so all that worked like it was supposed to. Now, I want to show you one more method for joining a device to your Azure AD, and then of course in turn having it joined to Intune. You can go to the Microsoft Store. So if we go to Microsoft Store, there is an app called the Intune Company Portal app, and this is actually one of the preferred ways Microsoft likes users to interact involving Intune is with the Intune Company Portal. So if you go there and just do a search for the Intune company portal. This can be, this little company app right here can be, you can get that app. This little app can be installed, and then you can put your credentials in. As long as you have a license for Intune, it'll allow you to register your machine into Intune as well. The last way that devices can be joined to Azure AD and with Intune is through an app registration. App registration is where, for example, if you download, let's say you download Office 365 and you open up Word or Excel, and you've got a license for all that, it'll detect that you've got a license for Azure AD and Intune, and it'll ask you if you would like to register your device. And if the user clicks yes to that, it'll register the user's device to Azure AD and Intune as well. So that's another way that this all happens. Okay. Now, I do like to warn you that doing all this auto join stuff, and depending upon the way you've got your environment set up, can be a little bit of a pain in the butt sometimes. It's pretty easy to do all that. You saw me go through the steps, but I have seen where users have had problems with getting that to work. Okay, like right now, it says this device hasn't been set up for corporate use yet, and that just means that even though I've been registered, it hadn't linked me over to Intune yet, which is fine. I'm actually going to take this. I'm not going to use this virtual machine right now in regards to Intune, because I need to move my license back over to my John Christopher account. This auto join account is not what I wanted to use it for anyway. I just want to demonstrate that, but I've only got one license that I can play around with in my little subscription here, because I don't have an evaluation anymore. But the main thing here that I want to get across is, if you are having problems with the Azure AD auto join and all that, you need to refer to their documentation. If you go to Google or Bing and search Azure AD auto join Active Directory, there is an article right here, Configure Hybrid Azure AD Join. If you click on that, they've got a lot of helpful documentation. Microsoft even has an official video that steps you through the process. Not too different than what I just showed you, but it does help see it from a different angle. And you can look at the prerequisites. You can look at the troubleshooting. I have, at any given time, hundreds of students taking these courses, and I'm very, very, very thankful for that. I want you guys to know I'm very thankful for that, and I don't take that for granted. But unfortunately, I can't troubleshoot everybody's issue here. Sometimes I'll get email after email of, I can't get this auto join to work, or I can't get that. And a lot of times unfortunately, I'm not on your side. I can't see what you're doing wrong. It's hard for me to see what you're doing wrong. I'm not telling you not to email me if you're not having a problem. I just can't promise you that I can fix it from my standpoint, because there are so many issues. There are so many things that could be going on if the auto join is not working. So my recommendation is refer to their documentation. If you can't get it to work in the real world, you might want to contact their support and let them try to help you. But this document right here is definitely helpful in that regard. All right. Well, hopefully this has helped make some sense to you on doing the auto join, as well as just joining manually and getting machines linked into Azure AD using Autopilot is another way we can do it. Using the Intune company portal is another way we can do it with Windows. You've got Configuration Manager, which we're not really looking at right now, but Config Manager can force machines to join as well. So there are various ways that devices can join, and hopefully this helps you with visualizing this and understanding it. I'd now like to explain to you what the Intune connector for Active Directory is. So we know that Intune is an incredibly powerful product. We know that it does not require that we even have Active Directory domains. We can manage machines that are not part of the domain. But if we are in a hybrid Azure AD joined domain, so we've got our Azure AD Connect and all that set up, and we're synchronizing, this connector can come in handy. And I want to, before I demonstrate it, I want to show you some helpful information that you can very easily find. If you go to Google or Bing and you do a quick search for Intune connector for Active Directory, you'll come across this right here, Enrollment for Hybrid Azure AD Join Devices. So if we click on that, all right, and we take a look, it tells you that the Intune connector for Active Directory creates autopilot enrolled computers in the on-premise Active Directory domain. So imagine you're in this situation where your company is utilizing autopilot with Intune for bringing in new machines and having those machines managed, and you are wanting to have those joined to Azure AD, you're wanting to have those managed through the domain as well as Intune. Well, you can, it is possible for us to very easily just have those machines joined to the domain and all that stuff to make life a little easier. We have it Azure AD joined, but also joined to the domain in a hybrid environment. But Microsoft is going to need us to install something in our domain on a server, and that agent is going to be what we're going to install will be the Intune connector for Active Directory. So we're going to need to put that on our machine. Okay. Now there are a few things, a few considerations, and all of that. They do tell you you need to. There's some delegation control and all that, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But what I want to do is I want to jump over to Intune. So here we are on endpoint.microsoft.com, which is the Intune Admin Center. All right, and we're going to click on Devices, and we're going to go to Enroll Devices. And if we scroll down to the bottom of this screen, you will see right here where it says Windows Autopilot Deployment Program, Intune Connector for Active Directory. We'll click that. All right, and then at that point it says we can add a connector for our domain. So we'll click Add, and then it says Configure the Intune Connector for Active Directory. Configure your account and server to connect to the on-premise Intune connector for Active Directory, and then download and install the on-premise Intune connector for Active Directory. So those are the things it's telling us we need to do. So the first being we need to configure your account. So the logic is this: your Intune connector it needs to be set up so that Autopilot can communicate with that connector, and the computer that is communicating in conjunction with this connector needs to be able to create computer accounts for those Autopilot joined machines. And so we've got to give it permission to do that. And that's what they're telling you, step by step right here is what they're telling you. But I'm going to demonstrate it for you right now. So here I am. I'm on my domain controller, NYCDC1, okay, and we're going to make that my connector. All right. So I'm going to go into Server Manager, go to Tools, Active Directory, Users, and Computers, and we're going to go into our Cloud Synced OU, which is where our, which is what Azure AD Connect and all of that stuff uses. All right, I'm just going to create a new OU. I'm going to call that organizational unit, and you don't have to call it this, but I'm going to call it Autopilot Domain Join. All right. And then we'll just click OK to that. And the next thing we got to do is we've got to give this, it's kind of funny, we're going to give this computer the authority to create accounts. Now, if you didn't know it, by default in Active Directory, objects that try to create computer accounts can only create 10 computer accounts. That's been an old rule that's been in place since Windows 2000 came out. So what we got to do is we got to give it permission to be able to do beyond 10. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click Autopilot Domain Join. We're going to click Delegate Control, Next, Add. We're going to add this computer's name. This computer's name is NYCDC1 because that's going to be the connector. We can't, if we type NYCDC1 right now, it's not going to work because if you look right here where it says Object Types, computers aren't displayed. So we're going to select Computers. Now we should be able to add NYCDC1. We're going to click Next. And when we get to this here, we are going to choose to create a custom task to delegate. It's custom permissions. And we're going to select the only objects in the folder. We're going to do computer accounts or computer objects. We're going to allow it to create computer objects. and we're going to say create selected objects in this folder and delete selected objects in this folder as well. So those are permissions. We're going to click next. Oops, I didn't mean to hit cancel. Let's go back and do that real quick. You get to see me do it twice. All right. Okay, so there's that. There we go. So computer accounts, those two, we're going to click next. Now for this, we're going to select all these checkboxes and full control, next, and finish. That's it. We've now we've given the privileges that need to be set. Now let's go back to web browser here, and we're ready to download the on-premise Intune connector. So we're going to go ahead and click that. All right, even though it's kind of warning you, hey, this is an exe file, it could be unsafe, that's fine. We're going to click keep, and we're going to say keep anyway, and we'll let that download. It's it doesn't take too long. Then we'll click open. All right, so we're just waiting on this little menu to pop up, or this little wizard to pop up here, install setup wizard. We'll agree to the terms. We'll click install. Okay, so now it's just going through that setup process of installing the connector for Active Directory. All right, as you can see, putting the agent updater in place, and it's getting close to being done. Okay, now before I configure this, tell it to configure, there's some other step I need to do. I need to disable the Internet Explorer enhanced security features that will prevent this from being able to run. So I'm hitting Server Manager, going to local server, and you'll see this Internet Explorer enhanced security. So we're just going to turn this off. It's not really adding a lot of extra protection to the server anyway. Now I'm going to hit start, and we'll run the connector. So now it's going to ask me to sign in. All right, so now I'm going to put in my credentials. Okay, do you want Internet Explorer to remember the password? That's fine, yes. Stay signed in, yes. All right, it says the Intune connector for Active Directory successfully enrolled. We can click OK. All right, and just like that, we have now officially set up the Intune connector. So now when we use Autopilot, we can have Autopilot joined devices. These devices will automatically get created inside this Autopilot domain join. All right, so if that is something of interest to you, something you might want to implement in your environment, that is how you do that. I'd now like to talk to you a little bit about how we deal with groups with machines that are managed by Intune. Now, here's the thing. All Windows machines come with something called local groups. And local groups on a Windows machine is generally how you would give rights out to somebody. Don't let me get ahead of myself here, though. Let me show you what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to go here. I'm on my machine here. Now this machine is linked to Intune. And if I right-click my Start button here, I can go to Computer Management. And from there, I can open up what is called Local Users and Groups. Now this will show me Local Users and Groups. And I can see right here, Groups. And you can see the various groups that can be given, you can add somebody to give rights. So for example, I've got administrators, and I can see who's an administrator on the machine. These are called SIDs, by the way, security identifiers. They're used to identify certain services and things like that. In this case, that could be joined to the group. Every object gets a SID, a security identifier. It's just a unique number that is used to identify objects, but I'm not going to get too deep into that right now. But so if I want to add a user to make a user an admin or something like that on a machine, this is how I can go about doing that. I can go here and I can add them to this group, and from there we can make somebody an administrator on this machine. Okay. Now, of course, the problem with all of this is what happens when you have a user that needs to be an admin on every machine. Maybe you've got 100 machines or 1,000 machines, and you got a user that needs to be an admin on every machine. Well, in a domain, you can do this through group policies. There is a thing called restricted groups. Sort of the old way of doing it. You could go in and create a group policy and do it through restricted groups. Now, this is the old way of doing it. I'm not going to demonstrate that right now, but if you are in a domain and you want to do that, just do a quick Google or Bing search on group policy restricted groups, and there's lots of articles out there that'll tell you how to do that. Okay, what we want to know how to do though is how can we put somebody in a group using Intune. So again, if I had 1,000 machines being managed by Intune, and I've got a user that needs to be a member of the administrators group or the remote desktop users group or whatever group, so that they have rights, how do I go about doing that? So I want to show you how we can do that right now. All right. So all I'm going to do is go into in my web browser here. I'm going to go to endpoint.microsoft.com. All right. From there, this is the Intune Admin Center. We're going to go to Endpoint Security. All right. And from there, we will go, let's find it here, Account Protection. And then we're going to click Create Policy. And so we'll go right here. We'll select Windows 10 and later. That's the only operating systems it supports currently. And then we'll go to where it says Select Profile. We'll click Local User Group Membership. So now we'll click Create. All right. And then we would specify the name. Maybe this is going to be for my New York admins. I could create a profile for that, or how about we just do this? We'll say JC admin always. So John Christopher admin always. So I'll click next, and then we'll say administrator. So here's some of the available groups that we have for this. All right. And then we can say we want to add something, remove something, or replace something. So we're going to add something, and we're going to say users group. So you can also, if you say user group, you can just select it. If you say manual, you can type a user group that you want to put in there. You can also use security identifiers. In our case, we're going to go with users and groups here. We'll select the user. We're going to say JC. We'll find my user account. So John Christopher, we'll click select. And at that point, we'll click next. If we want to apply a scope tag, we could. And then we would click assignments. And I would assign, from here, I would assign what groups I want this to be this is going to be affecting. Or I could say all users, all devices. Okay. So I'm going to say all users and all devices. All right. And ultimately from there, we'll click next. Oh, and by the way, there is excluded. Just always remember that if you ever see exclusions, inclusion, an included group will always an excluded group will always override an included group. So if I was to specify a group, then and I had an included group and then I had an excluded group, and you had a user or device that's a member of both of those, this is always the case in Intune. Excluded would always overrule it. So if I was to add a group right now, and let's say I had a group called like New York devices or something, then it would exclude those. It would exclude any device that was in that if I added that to this excluded group. All right. Not really getting too deep into that right now. I just wanted to give you an overview. Then I'll click next, and then I'll click create, and that's it. We've now set this up. And at this point, as time goes on, this will take time for computers for this to trickle down. And I'm talking sometimes it could take an hour for this to trickle down. But at that point, this user, JC in this case, should become an admin, should be put in the admins group and have admin credentials on all of the machines that are being managed by Intune in this case. Now, something I can do if I want to trigger this to happen a little bit quicker on the machine, I can jump over to devices here and click the device. Let's go to Windows, and then here's the device NYCCL11, and we're going to tell it to sync. Else, again, this could take 15 minutes to an hour. I would still warn you that it could still take 5-10 minutes, and even then, if it doesn't appear to work immediately, you might want to try rebooting the computer. Okay, rebooting the machine just to trigger it to happen faster. It'll eventually happen, but if you're in a hurry, that would be my recommendation. Let's jump over to the client now. So here we are on NYCCL11. Again, if you forgot how we got here in the groups area, we just right click start. We go to computer management. Then we'll go over here to local users and groups, click groups, and then double click on administrators. And looky there, Azure AD John Christopher has been added. That was not there before. Okay, so as you can see, it was added, and that is how you make this work. So it's a great little feature. It makes life a little easier. There's been ways to do this in the past, but this is a newer way, and it's a much easier way, and definitely something to check out. But hopefully that helps you now understand the concepts of managing your local groups with the help of Microsoft Intune. An additional add-on we can utilize with Intune that can be very helpful in the workplace is a feature called Remote Help. Now, Remote Help is going to allow a help desk operator of some type or some IT person that needs to provide help to our users. A user can request help, and this person can remote into that person's machine and control their desktop and hopefully fix the problem that they're having. Now, there is a couple of considerations with this, that mainly that this is a licensed thing, and depending upon the license you have with Intune on your users, you may not have remote help built in. So first thing I want to show you is if we go to Google or Bing and just do a search for Intune Remote Help, you're going to find this article right here. Use Remote Help with Microsoft Intune. If we go there and we scroll down, we can see what this is going to apply to. So you can see that it only applies currently to Windows 10 and higher, in this case Windows 10 and 11. And if I scroll down, the prerequisites to this is you got to have an Intune subscription, but there's also, you have to have a Remote Help add-on license or an Intune suite license. So that's a pretty important one. I'll check that in just a second. Another thing would be network considerations. We got to make sure that we do have, the Remote Help does use port 443 HTTPS. That's good. That's usually open on people's machines. And we got to make sure that the remote assistant services at this URL right here are not being blocked by any type of firewall. The other thing is these domain names here will be utilized for interacting with some services involving remote help, so we would want to make sure that our firewall is not blocking any of that as well. Okay, so let's go back, and I want to look at the licensing because that's going to be the first thing you need to be aware of here. So we're going to go Remote Help Add-on License. If we click on that and we'll scroll down, you can see that there is essentially 3 ways that you can get this. You can have what's called the Intune Suite License, which gives you everything, Intune Plan 2, or a standalone add-on of it. Now, if I go back to portal.microsoft.com, all right, and if we click under billing here, I can look at licenses, and I can see what licenses I have. Now, my Intune, in my case, is available through this Enterprise Mobility Plus Security E5. That's the license that I have involving Intune. And if I click that, now I can see in my case that I just have this one license here assigned to John Christopher. And if I click on that, I can see that this Enterprise Mobility Plus Security license is for Intune Plan 1. Okay, and if I jump back over and look at this table, you can see that they don't mention that in this table. They do mention Intune Plan 2, but it doesn't have remote help included. So there's really only two ways to get a remote help add-on, and that is to just purchase the add-on standalone, or if you have the Intune suite. And that usually comes with some of the Microsoft 365 subscriptions and all of that. So that's something you may have, but it's something you'd have to check. So in my case, what I'm going to do is go back over here to the portal.microsoft.com. I'm going to go to Purchase Services. Now if we look at the Microsoft 365 options here and just search the word help, we should be able to find the add-on. So there it is right there, Remote Help Add-on. If we click, you'll notice it says $350 a license per month. So that's per user that's going to use it. And in this case, I've never used my free trial, so I am going to use my free trial for this. I'm going to hit Start Free Trial right here. And then it gives me a confirmation page, which I just hit Continue on that. It does have some personal information on it, so that's why I didn't show it. But if I go over here now to Billing and I look at Licenses, scroll down, and you can see right here it says I have Intune Remote Help, and I do have 250 licenses. Okay, so that's great. So I'm good to go. I could have a let's create a user, add a user, and we'll just call this Help Operator for lack of a better name. All right, Help Operator at examlabpractice.com. Okay, and I'll just create a password that I want to use for it. Okay, let me just make sure I didn't typo that. There we go. Require the user change password at first log on. I'm going to turn that off. Obviously, in the real world, you generally won't want to do that. And then I'm just going to hit Next. And then we will assign, let's go right here and assign this license. Next. All right, and I'm not going to do anything else to that user. We'll just pretend like that's going to be our operator. Okay. So we'll go back over here to look at licenses and look at our Intune Remote Help. We've assigned one license. All right. And eventually it will be done fetching data, and it'll show the user that that's been assigned. Help Operator. And I'm going to go ahead and assign this to John Christopher. All right. So we'll assign John Christopher a license. All right, so we've now got our two licenses added, one to Help Operator and one to John Christopher. Now I'm going to go over to the left-hand side of the screen here. We're just going to open up where it says Endpoint Manager. That's going to bring us into the Intune Admin Center now. And from there, we're going to click on Tenant Administration, and you're going to see a little blade here called Remote Help. And you'll see that if I go here to Settings, you'll see that Remote Help is currently disabled. So we're going to hit Configure. We're going to enable that. It says Allow Remote Help to unenrolled devices. I'm going to go ahead and say Allowed on that. That's fine. And we're going to hit Save. You could also say Disable Chat. I'm going to allow that. So I'm just going to hit Save. All right. At that point, we have Remote Help enabled in our environment. Now what I want to do is I need to give the rights over to people who are going to be providing this remote help. And to do that, we're going to do this through roles. We're going to create a group for that first. We're going to go over here to Groups. All right, and we're going to click to create a new group. Remember, all this is tied back to Azure, Active Directory, Microsoft 365. It's all tied to the same repository, so it's not like I'm creating a group in Intune and nowhere else. All right. So I'm going to specify a group here, and this group will just be called Remote Help Operators. Okay, and I can actually put spaces there. I didn't put a space. I'll go ahead and fix that. All right, and at that point we will just let's just go ahead and assign some members here. I'm going to allow my help operator to be part of that. So help operator, and then we'll also, I'm going to make myself, I'll put myself in there as well. Okay, so there we go. We've created the group. Now what we're going to do is go back over to tenant administration. We're going to go to roles. Now a role, and I'm not really thoroughly explaining roles in this video, but a role is how you're going to give privileges out. You're going to give administrative privileges out to somebody. So there is a role here you'll notice you have called help desk operator. So we'll go ahead and click on that role, and then go to assignments. By the way, you can look at the properties and you can see the rights that this role is going to have. All right. So you'll notice you do have remote assistance, you have remote help, view screen, elevation, take full control. So we'll click that assignment. Now we'll give this a name. Let's just call this help operators for remote help permissions. Okay. I'm not going to worry about a description. And we're going to click next. So then we've got the admin group. This is going to be the group of users that you want to give this privilege to. So we're going to click add, and of course we're going to give this to the remote help operators group that we've created. And then we're going to click next. Now you got scope group. Scope group is going to be which users or devices that these admins can affect. And in this case, I'm going to say all users. Okay. And then I'm going to click next. And scope tags, I'm not really getting into details on scope tags right now. All I will say about that is scope tags can be used as a way to hide things for certain groups of admins. So I might have different levels of admins, like junior admins or mid-level admins, and I may not want junior level admins seeing certain items inside of Intune if they are assisting me with Intune. Again, not getting into a lot of depth on that. It's kind of outside the scope, no pun intended, of what I'm trying to get across to you right now. But this isn't really a video about scope tags. But there you go. So I'm going to click next on that, and then I'm going to click create. And we've now assigned our role. So we've got our role created and good to go on that. Now, what I want to do is I would want to install the remote help download app. I want to download that remote help app and run it. So I've actually already done it on the machine where I'm at, but I'll show you the process. It's really easy. If we go back over to this article, use remote help with Microsoft Intune, just do a Google or Bing search for remote help with Intune and you'll find this article. And then we'll just scroll down, and Microsoft has a little download link right here. So we just click that little download link. You can see I've already got it. We open the file and it just has a little wizard. We click next to it a couple times and it's installed. All right. The next thing would be to open up the actual app itself. So I'm going to hit start, and here is remote app right here. So I'll open that up, and I'm just doing this on the computer I'm physically sitting at. All right, it says it looks like you have signed in. Okay, so let's. It's requiring me to authenticate here. All right, so I'm going to put in, let's see, help operator at examlabpractice.com. We'll click next. Put in my password for that. All right, so at that point it's requiring me to accept some information. All right, so now it says help solve problems on someone's device or get help if you're stuck. Then here it says let someone you trust take control of your device to solve your problem, or give help. Help someone with a problem. All right, so that's good. And so let's say that I'm the help operator, so I want to help somebody. So let's jump over to a virtual machine now and see how we can get help on a virtual machine. All right, so here I am on this Windows 11 virtual machine, and we're just going to act like a client who needs help now. So I've already installed the app on the machine. So if I click here and I go to remote help, pull that up here and accept the terms. Okay, so here it is, JC at Exam Lab Practice. Now again, on my host computer, I've got it on a different account, which is the help operator account. So I'm going to go right here, and at this point, it says help someone with a problem or get help. So the operator is going to say help someone with a problem on the device. So we'll click that, okay, and then we've got this little code right here. So that we're going to enter in that little code, right, which is 6GC79J. 6GC79J, right? And we're going to hit submit. All right, so you can see, and again, this is simulating two different computers, right? So this is going to be the computer that needs help. This is the computer that's going to help. All right, so at this point, it says John Christopher is sharing the screen here, so we'll say, we can say view screen, or we can say take full control. All right, if we want. So we'll just say take full control. All right, waiting for the person you're helping to share. So this person, the person you're helping, has got to allow it. All right. Of course, you know, the machine that I'm getting help on doesn't have a lot of memory. Okay, so there you go. And this does look a little crazy just because, you know, I'm doing this in one screen. But as you can see, I can move this mouse around and I can click on things. You can see it changing. So that this person would be able to provide assistance to this user and help this user. Okay. The other thing, of course, is, you know, you got some menu options up here that you can play around with, laser, pointer, pen, and all that stuff. And so you definitely, you know, can have some control. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave here, leave out of that. And that is the idea about this. And again, what's really great about this is you're not having to open up a bunch of ports or anything like that to make this work. Some of the older scenarios in which you provided some support for somebody, you'd have to open up port 3389 on your firewall. You'd have to do what's called NAT forwarding and or port forwarding through network address translation. It was a big headache. This doesn't. This actually uses some Microsoft Cloud services as intermediaries using port 443, so it's not having to do that. So that's a really great capability, really great feature that we get. And the other thing is, let's go back over here to Endpoint Manager, Intune, the Intune Admin Center. So we'll go over here to Devices here, and let's look at Windows enrolled devices, and I have NYC CL 11B here, and you can see that it's, you know, it's registered in there. It's registered as a device that is inside of Intune. So it is a managed device, and I am able to monitor it. Of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to managing these devices and all of that within Intune, this device is actually joined, but because of the choice that I made when I enabled this, this device doesn't have to necessarily be joined. That I guess that's the point I'm trying to make here. It doesn't necessarily have to be joined. You know, it's great that it is. All right. You'll also notice there's a new remote assistance session if we click on that. All right. And it says new remote assistance, and it says launch remote help, right? So if I open that up, this is a way to trigger launching remote help to provide help for somebody, and then you can go through that process. Of course, I think it's quicker just to hit start and go to the app, but it is possible for you to click on the device you want to manage, and then go right here, click new remote assistance session, and away you go. All right. All right, well, hopefully that has been instructive for you. Now you should understand the concepts of using remote help in regards to Intune. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed that video, and I want you to know that I'm trying really hard to grow this channel, so I hope you'll give me a like and a subscribe. Also, if you'll check the description in this video, I've got a link for you that can show you how you can get access to all my different courses. I have lots of different Microsoft certification courses that'll help you pass your exam. All right, thanks a lot for watching the video, and I hope to see you again.